From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
And we have returned. We have not returned alone. Now, for the next few minutes, we are accompanied by Knockout Ned, which is a great name. That's a knockout nickname, Ned. Tongue twister, future, mental note. So Knockout Ned wrote to us twice over this month with some information about a troubling thing that candidly is going to be a personal matter to a lot of our fellow listeners in the audience today. And it examines a tragedy that remains somewhat mysterious and, in truth, may never actually be solved. Knockout Ned, I am going to read some excerpts from your emails, but if you want to hear the whole story after you learn some of these revelations and you'd like to read Knockout Ned's emails in full, please just hit us up at conspiracy@iheartradio.com. And I'm glad to share the full story while preserving this Knockout Ned's anonymity. So, Knockout Ned, you said you all must do a piece on the Special Operations Group, or SOG, of the Vietnam War. Ultimately, these were a bunch of Army Rangers who worked with indigenous forces in Vietnam and ran top-secret missions into Laos and Cambodia when we were not supposed to be there. Side note, that is true. That is proven. Their casualty rate was over 100%. That bears some scrutiny. They were instructed not to speak about their missions for at least 20 years. These guys were crazy. Knockout Ned, you recommend that we listen to Jocko Willnick's podcast episode 205, and I promise you will not believe what you hear. These guys are worth a full episode. They went into combat with no dog tags, sterile uniforms, told if they were caught, they were on their own, always behind enemy lines, always outnumbered, missions directly from the White House or the CIA. And then we got a follow-up from you, Ned, where you said you did an episode on whether America left soldiers behind in Vietnam, and if some of those missing soldiers were left due to the clandestine nature of their top-secret missions. Well, the SOG, the Studies and Observation Group, were the soldiers you were thinking about. There's stories that when an SOG team went missing and couldn't be located, a B-52 would bomb the last known areas, as it was understood that these guys could not be taken alive. They were high-priority targets for the Viet Cong, and when they learned about them, they created SOG kill teams where they used human trackers and bloodhounds to hunt them. Many of them disappeared and were never found. And then, Knockout Ned, you continue with this, and you also explain that interesting part of having an over 100% casualty rate by saying the fact that SOG teams were 7, maybe 9 members, and they were usually facing an enemy with numbers in the hundreds, only adds to the allure, the mythology of this. And then Knockout Ned ends by saying, you have to do an episode on these guys. They're now able to tell their stories, so there should be no shortage of information out there. You can probably get one to come onto your show. I'm telling you, go into a dark room and turn off all the lights and listen to Dick Thompson speak in that podcast I referenced in my first email. It will blow your mind. It's a hell of a story. Do you guys remember when we looked into the very, very strange things that were occurring, especially toward the close of the Vietnam War?
Yes, I do. And there are a lot of tales, there are stories that have been told in popular media about the Vietnam War. We've mentioned a lot of these in the past, and there are a lot of tales about soldiers who were left behind or got stuck there for one reason or another. And when we covered it before, it still felt like something that, again, we just talked about. You want to believe your country is going to be the good guy. You want to believe your team is the right team. Those blinders that we're mentioning. And more and more we learn that the nature of warfare is so gray. There's so many awful things that happen to everybody when there's a hot war going on. And this whole topic, I think, is it Special Operations Group or Studies and Observation Group? He calls it a couple different things in his emails, but it's whatever it was. These soldiers, if they were real, and I'm sure you're going to tell me if they were or not, Ben, going into Laos and Cambodia when they shouldn't be there, doing these secret things, the government had to keep that distance, had to act like it wasn't truly happening, or it wasn't their idea. It was just a couple of bad apples that found themselves in Cambodia while Vietnam was facing the conflict. It's just awful to think about it that way, because the individual person or the 3 Americans and all of the Laotian or Cambodian citizens are being affected.
Yeah. And you're right, Matt. This is definitely a real group. Specifically, it's MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group.
Okay.
This letter, and Knockout Ned, we really appreciate you going back and checking out that earlier episode. There had been a few things. Let's see, that was probably 2014, maybe. I'm just guessing. There, unfortunately, after multiple congressional investigations, the official conclusion of the U.S. government is that there were no people left behind alive. But if you talk to a lot of Vietnam veterans, you will see that many do not believe that official story. It is true. It is inarguable that some bodies had never been recovered from Vietnam. On both sides, people disappeared in the tragic circumstances of war. But the big question is, were any soldiers left alive? And this could happen for a number of reasons. One, if it is a clandestine mission and plausible deniability, the clean hands principle takes precedent, then the argument there is that those folks got left behind, but they knew what they were signing up for before things went south. The second idea is that someone would be caught, captured, kept as a POW, and kept alive, which is strange to think about, because you have to ask yourself about the logic there, right? Like, why would you, if you are holding an American POW in your captivity, why would you keep them alive? As brutal and cold as it sounds, would it not be more politically convenient to either release them in a gesture of goodwill or pull a quid pro quo, or to simply quietly end their lives? Which is brutal, but that is sometimes the calculus of war. The third one, perhaps more interesting, is the idea of a U.S. soldier voluntarily staying, right? Just saying, hey, stuff in the U.S. wasn't quite, I didn't enjoy it there. This is my chance to start over. This is my chance to escape.
Totally.
It happened once.
Did we do an episode on this? I feel like
We did.
was ringing a bell. Yeah.
Ben just mentioned it. It was 2017, Ben.
2017.
It was, oh Lord, the title, did the U.S. abandon soldiers in Southeast Asia?
Well, I was thinking of something else, even maybe like a history thing, like about someone who kind of like basically switched sides and then kind of got found out later. So I'm sorry, it's a little hazy, but this all is very much ringing a bell.
Well, there's another story that's not Vietnam related. It's James Joseph Dresnok. He joined the North Korean military in 2014.
That's the one.
So there are reports, multiple reports of U.S. service members defecting to North Korea, people like Joseph T. White, people like who we just mentioned. And in our previous episode that we're just talking about regarding the Vietnam War, what we found was disturbing because we see a discrepancy in the stories. And that itself is not uncommon, but what is circumstantially troubling here is that we know in the circumstances of at least a few operations, that are known to the public now, and at least a few of those operations, plausible deniability was a huge thing. These people were literally told, if this goes wrong, then you have died. Even if you haven't died, you have died.
And we will bomb your last known location.
Right. And we shall sow the earth with the salt of bombs and bullets. So this hasn't ever really gone cold. And the idea of solving this mystery and proving whether or not people were left in Vietnam or abandoned to die it's still very much a concern for people who have survived the Vietnam War, or for people who lost relatives to it, or for people, whose parents or their siblings were involved. Another thing interesting about this SOG group in Vietnam is that they were tasked with taking the fight to the enemy, quote unquote, the enemy, regardless of where they were, even if it was in Cambodia, Laos, or North Vietnam. That's where U.S. troops were not supposed to be, which means their specialty was breaking the laws that the U.S. had agreed to follow. This is the definition of black bag operations. These guys were the real deal. They were in the shit, as veterans would say. But I wasn't quite, like, to knock out Ned's point, I listened back to our episode, and we did a good job with the information we had, I think. But at the time, some of these people still were probably not speaking for one reason or another about their experiences. So I did some digging, and I reached out to some contacts, some sources, some veterans, and the stuff that they said, I don't know if it would surprise you all to hear it, but they said they absolutely believe it's true. I think a lot of veterans believe people were left behind in Vietnam, and without having our episode notes handy from 2017, as Matt said, what do you guys think when you hear this? Do you think that it is possible that these people were purposely left behind?
Think about the conflict we're talking about here in the Vietnam War. The brass knew that there were war crimes happening on the ground in Vietnam that were being perpetrated by U.S. forces and U.S. supported forces. They knew that. They also knew that if they entered into other sovereign nations, other sovereign states like Laos and Cambodia, that's just more stuff that makes them look really, really bad. Even if there were strategic targets in those countries, or, there were supplies coming from those countries that were aiding, in this case, the quote enemy, it's such a bad look. And it makes complete sense to me that somebody at the very top, very cold and calculated, would make the decision to make that the policy, that you will not be coming back if you get caught.
Yeah, and that would explain the idea of bombing the area where they were last located, so that there would literally be no physical proof of U.S. presence there. And this is, this is one of those arguments where you can picture the people in the room saying there is a greater good at play, but a greater good can oftentimes be dangerous for a smaller good, like individual safety.
Is this like a Black Ops type scenario, or you're disavowed if you ever caught, but you know that going in?
Yeah, that's what I was saying when I said it was black bag. Like
see.
a Black Ops would be a black bag, kind of. Mm-hmm. But I guess black bag is more like black budget. But I think if you're in the U.S., you get the gist.
It's also the thing they put over your head when they disappear you.
Yes, yeah, that's correct. Being black bagged can be a verb, unfortunately, because that's the world in which we live. Here's the twist. I looked into, as I said, I reached out to some folks who preferred to remain anonymous, but I wanted to share this with you guys. First, someone wrote to me and told me that that the odds of military members getting rescued or hostages getting rescued, depending on where you are in the world, is actually very low, and it would disturb the public to realize this is not necessarily negligence, but just to realize how difficult it is to conduct an extraction mission like that safely. Even the hardcore pros might find the circumstances challenging. And then I heard back from someone, again, wishing to remain anonymous. Here's their take. They took this in a totally different direction. They responded when I asked, do you believe that people were intentionally left behind alive in Vietnam or Southeast Asia in general? They said, I do not believe that it was intentionally done, but in the late 60s and early 70s, there were some rumors that people who had contracted, quote, the Black VD had been purposely retained in Vietnam. On the other hand, there is a solid possibility that a number of people were retained by the North Vietnamese government, either because they knew things about North Vietnam that were not in the best interest of the country, or because they had serious injuries caused by interrogation techniques. And lastly, there were numerous stories about commanders who would put their problem children on point continually because if that individual was killed or captured, it was no big loss. I have not seen firsthand data about these claims, says this source, but I did know a couple of guys who worked body recovery in the 80s, and they refused to venture their opinions to me.
Interesting. Black VD, you mean venereal disease, like some sort of infection?
That's the twist. That's what stood out to me as well. So I asked, what is Black VD? We've got Agent Orange. Isn't that enough? Black VD is a venereal disease that could not be cured, and supposedly, according to people who believe this theory, it may have been the first of HIV contractions that people were aware of, which would absolutely change the story of the progression of AIDS and HIV. But the story is that there were some people who went on R&R in other countries, or were living the red light lifestyle when they weren't working.
Sure.
And that they came back with something that doctors didn't recognize, other than the fact that it was incurable.
How about that? So is the implication almost in the way that, is it like blaming Vietnam for AIDS?
I'm not sure. Well, because specifically the way the theory goes is that they didn't contract it necessarily in Vietnam. They went to an adjacent country.
I see.
But it's, if you're looking into the evolution of AIDS itself, the official story, according to the CDC, is that a San Francisco resident named Ken Horn was the first person identified in the 1980s with having contracted AIDS. He's considered the first patient of the AIDS epidemic in the U.S. But then, like we did in our AIDS episode, we traced back several other theories, right? It's just strange that this lore has entered here as well. As I'm with you guys, it is difficult to say without definitive proof. It is difficult to say for sure whether or not people were non-consensually left alive in that country, sacrificed at the altar of the greater good. But at least one other thing, and that's what I want to end this on. The next thing we have to think about, what are we going to learn 20 years after the Iraq War? The U.S. is pulling out the U.S. is pulling out a lot of troops in Afghanistan in the upcoming days. Private contractors will remain. What are we going to learn about that? What is going to be the story about the so-called graveyard of empires? What other dirty secrets are going to come out? And when will this end? To all the veterans in the audience today, we hope this message finds you safe. We hope this message finds you well. And we would love to hear your take. Do you think this is simply, like an urban legend at this point? Or is there a grain of truth to it?